A family posed for a photograph in 1860. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, but the longer you looked, the more one figure demanded your attention, the young black woman standing quietly behind them. Rachel Chen, a specialist in 19th century photograph restoration at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, spent her life uncovering hidden stories buried in silver and glass. Her days were spent among daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes, fragile windows into a past America preferred to forget. Most images she handled were of white families, proud, composed, and eager to immortalize their wealth. Occasionally, however, the enslaved appeared in these portraits too, tucked in the background, their presence recorded but their humanity denied. One humid August morning in Richmond, Virginia, Rachel attended an estate sale. The collection once belonged to a retired antiques dealer named Howard Preston, a man who had spent 40 years gathering Civil War-era artifacts. His family was selling everything. Rachel's task was simple: locate anything of historical value for the museum's archives. She sifted through boxes filled with familiar scenes: uniformed soldiers, plantation homes, and stiff family portraits. But then her hands froze. Inside one worn leather case was a daguerreotype that felt different. It captured a wealthy white family of 5, a stern father, a dignified mother, and 3 well-dressed children standing before a stately brick house. Yet Rachel's focus wasn't on them. It was on the woman standing just behind, young, maybe 20, dressed in a plain calico gown and head wrap. Her back was straight. Her face, turned slightly toward the lens, held a quiet strength. Rachel tilted the photograph toward the light. Something about that woman's gaze, alert, intelligent, refused to fade into the background. And then she saw it. A faint necklace, a delicate string of beads barely visible above the collar of her dress. The case was marked simply, Richmond, Virginia, 1860. Rachel purchased the daguerreotype, along with a few others, and began the long drive back to Washington. But her mind kept circling back to that woman, to those beads. There was something in that image that refused to let go. Days later, inside the museum's conservation lab, Rachel placed the photograph beneath a high-resolution scanner. The screen illuminated every grain, every imperfection of the old plate. She zoomed in, first on the woman's face, then her eyes. There was defiance there, quiet but unmistakable. Then she turned her focus to the necklace. As she magnified the image, her breath caught. The beads formed a pattern, deliberate and precise. 3 white, 2 red, 1 black, 2 red, 3 white, repeating in exact rhythm. This was not decoration. It was a message. Rachel had spent years studying African American material culture. She knew what she was looking at. Patterns like these often carried meaning. Connections to ancestry, lineage, or even spiritual identity. For generations, enslaved people had hidden their heritage in plain sight through songs, quilts, carvings, and beads. To most eyes, it was simple jewelry. To Rachel, it was survival encoded in color. Rachel needed answers, not theories, but truth. She reached out to Dr. Amara Okafor, a respected scholar at Howard University who specialized in West African cultural traditions and their survival across the Atlantic. Rachel sent her the high-resolution scans, explaining where the photograph had come from. Richmond, Virginia, 1860. 2 hours later, her phone rang. "Rachel," Dr. Okafor said, her voice alive with excitement. "This is extraordinary. That pattern, 3 white beads, 2 red, 1 black, 2 red, 3 white. It is not random. It is Yoruba, a specific sequence representing lineage and spiritual protection." Rachel listened closely. Dr. Okafor continued, "The Yoruba people, from what is now Nigeria and Benin, used beadwork as a sacred form of communication. When they were torn from their homeland and forced into slavery, many tried to preserve these designs, hidden signals of who they were and where they came from. So, this woman," Rachel said slowly, staring again at the photograph, "she was keeping her connection alive, her heritage, through that necklace." "More than that," Dr. Okafor replied, her tone deepening. "She was making a statement. In 1860, in Richmond, Virginia, for an enslaved woman to wear such a pattern openly, that was courage. She was declaring her identity in defiance of a system built to erase it." Rachel stared at the image once more. The photograph no longer felt like a relic. It felt like resistance, a visual testament of survival, culture, and unbroken spirit. Determined to uncover more, she began the difficult task of identifying everyone in the daguerreotype. The museum's database offered endless records: census lists, property deeds, slave schedules, each one a cold piece of history waiting to be reawakened. She started with the White family. Their names, she reasoned, would be easiest to trace. The brick house in the background provided her first clue. Its distinctive columns matched only a few wealthy estates in Richmond's elite. District. Cross-referencing architectural records with the 1860 census, she found a match. The home belonged to Daniel Whitfield, a tobacco merchant. Listed in the census, Daniel, age 43, his wife Margaret, 39, and their children, Daniel Jr., 12, Mary, 9, and Thomas, 6. The ages, the setting, everything fit. Then came the harder part. The The slave schedule attached to the same census listed only one 20-year-old mulatto female. No name, no identity, just a number in a ledger. Rachel stared at the entry, frustrated. The silence of history was deafening. Refusing to stop there, she turned to the archives. Newspapers, estate records, even church announcements. She found small traces of the Whitfields, society events, business ads, mentions of Sunday attendance. Then, at last, something real. A Freedmen's Bureau record, dated 1865, the year the war ended. It documented newly freed individuals registering their names and occupations. Among them was one name that made Rachel's breath catch. Annie Whitfield, age 25, formerly enslaved by Daniel Whitfield, tobacco merchant. There she was. The woman in the photograph finally had a name. The record went further. Annie had registered her freedom in May 1865, just weeks after Union troops entered Richmond. Her occupation, seamstress. She had a daughter, 3 years old. Her name was Grace. For the first time, Rachel felt a surge of triumph. The woman who had once been nothing more than a background figure now had a name, a voice, and a legacy. Annie Whitfield had lived, worked, and raised a child under impossible circumstances. And now, more than a century later, her story was beginning to speak again. Rachel knew what she had to do next. If Annie had descendants, somewhere in the present day, they deserved to know the truth, and to see the woman who had quietly defied history through a string of colored beads. Rachel decided it was time to share what she had found. She uploaded a blurred version of the photograph, concealing the Whitfield family's faces, along with everything she had uncovered about Annie. A week later, an email arrived. The subject line read, "I think you found my great-great-great-grandmother." It was from a woman named Diane Washington, living in Atlanta. Her words carried both disbelief and recognition, the kind that only comes when something buried in family memory suddenly resurfaces. Diane explained that her family had preserved oral histories for generations, stories of survival passed quietly from mother to daughter. One of those stories was about a woman named Annie, enslaved in Richmond, who wore a special necklace said to protect her. "My grandmother used to tell me about Annie's necklace," Diane wrote. She said it was made in a pattern from Africa, 3 white, 2 red, 1 black, a pattern her mother had taught her before she was sold away as a teenager. It was the only thing she had left from her family. She wore it every day because she believed that as long as she did, her mother's protection would follow her. Please. Rachel read the email again and again, her eyes blurred with tears. The necklace was no longer just a symbol of cultural identity. It was a thread between a mother and daughter torn apart by slavery, a promise that love could outlast separation. She called Diane immediately. Their conversation stretched for more than an hour, each revelation deepening the connection between past and present. Diane told Rachel what her family had remembered about Annie's life. She was born around 1840 on a plantation in Tidewater, Virginia. Her mother was Yoruba, brought to America aboard a slave ship in the 1820s. From her, Annie learned the traditions of her people, their gods, their stories, their symbols, whispered secrets of identity and hope. When Annie was 15, she was sold to Daniel Whitfield and sent to Richmond to serve as a house servant. She never saw her mother or siblings again, but she kept the necklace. She kept the stories. And through those beads, she kept her people alive within her memory. After freedom came, Diane said, Annie began making more necklaces using the same pattern. She taught it to her daughter Grace, and Grace passed it on to her children. The design lived on, even after the meaning behind it faded. With Diane's permission, Rachel arranged a meeting at the museum with her and Dr. Amara Okafor. When Diane arrived, she brought a small collection of heirlooms, family photographs, old documents, and a handful of beaded jewelry passed down through generations. Each piece, in its own way, carried echoes of the original pattern, the one Annie had worn in 1860. Dr. Okafor examined the pieces one by one. Her eyes traced the symmetry, the rhythm of colors, the subtle evolution across time. "This is remarkable," she murmured, holding up a delicate bracelet made by Diane's grandmother in the 1950s. "The core pattern is still here, unchanged. Your family has preserved this link for over 150 years." She arranged the jewelry in a line, from oldest to newest. The beads told their own history, adapting, transforming, but never forgetting their roots. Then with quiet reverence, Dr. Okafor began to explain. "In Yoruba culture," she said, "beadwork is more than decoration. It carries spiritual and social meaning, a language of color and order. Every sequence tells a story." She pointed to the image of Annie's necklace on the screen. The pattern she wore, 3 white beads, 2 red, 1 black, then reversed, speaks of balance. 3 white for purity and spiritual connection, 2 red for life force and strength, and 1 black for the ancestors who dwell beneath the earth. She paused for a moment, her eyes fixed on the photograph. "This necklace was not an ornament," she said softly. "It was prayer made visible." Dr. Okafor leaned forward, his tone calm but reverent. "This pattern," he said, "wasn't random. Certain Yoruba families used it to mark royal or noble bloodlines." Diane's breath caught. "Royal lineage?" she whispered. "You mean Abeni's mother came from African royalty?" "Very possibly," Dr. Okafor replied. Many who were enslaved and brought to America weren't just villagers. Some were scholars, leaders, even royalty. The slavers saw only bodies, not bloodlines. But those who survived, they remembered who they were, and they found ways to hold on to that truth. Rachel glanced at Diane. She saw every emotion move across her face. Grief for what had been stolen, pride in what endured, and awe at the connection stretching back across an ocean. A Bainey wore this necklace in that photograph, Rachel said softly. Richmond, Virginia, 1860. She was enslaved in the Whitfield household. But by wearing this, she was declaring something powerful. Her voice trembled slightly as she read the meaning of the beads aloud. I know who I am. I know where I come from. I am not what you made me. I am my mother's daughter, my ancestors' blood. You can chain the body, but not the memory. Word of Rachel's discovery spread like wildfire across genealogical networks and heritage communities. Within weeks, more families came forward, each tracing a thread back to a Bainey. A family tree began to form, wide and intricate, stretching far beyond what anyone imagined. A Bainey had lived until 1898, around 58 years old. She had married twice after emancipation, raised her daughter Grace, and opened her home to orphaned children from the community. Her legacy, once forgotten, now numbered in the hundreds. Rachel organized a gathering at the museum that October. More than 60 of a Bainey's descendants filled the room, elders who carried her stories, and children seeing her face for the first time. At the front stood Marcus Washington, a Bainey's great-great-grandson, his voice steady at 86. All my life, he said, I heard stories about Mama Bainey. They said she never forgot where she came from. She taught us to stand tall in a world that wanted us small, and she wore a necklace that reminded us who we were. He lifted a fragile photograph, a Bainey in her later years, surrounded by grandchildren, the same necklace glimmering faintly at her throat. She wore it her whole life, Marcus continued. Through slavery, freedom, Reconstruction, through it all, that necklace wasn't jewelry. It was resistance. It was memory. As he spoke, Diane came forward, holding a carefully recreated pattern of the original beads. She and Dr. Okafor had mapped every detail, the sequence, the meaning, the Yoruba roots. This, Diane said quietly, is our inheritance. Not wealth, not land, but memory, identity, connection. Her voice broke slightly as she looked at the photograph. For more than 150 years, no one noticed. But now we do, and we know where it began. Driven by that discovery, Dr. Okafor began tracing the bead pattern back to Nigeria, consulting Yoruba historians and artisans who recognized the royal signature. Piece by piece, the story was returning home. The final breakthrough came from Dr. Fola Adabio, a cultural historian at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. When Dr. Adabio examined the bead pattern, her eyes lit up. I've seen this before, she said during a recorded call with Rachel. This is the signature of a Yoruba subgroup from the Oyo region, families once tied to the Alafin, the ruler of the old Oyo Empire. She explained that the pattern wasn't just decorative. It marked families who served in ceremonial and spiritual roles within the empire, people of importance, guardians of culture and tradition. But in the early 1800s, the empire began to fracture. Civil wars, rival claims to the throne, and attacks from neighboring states created chaos. During those years of turmoil, thousands were captured and sold into the transatlantic slave trade. Abeni's mother, Dr. Adabio said softly, was likely taken during those conflicts, in the 1820s or 1830s. She must have carried with her the stories, the knowledge, the language of her people, and somehow she passed enough of it to her daughter that even in Virginia, even in bondage, the pattern survived. When Rachel shared this revelation with the Bainey's descendants, the room fell completely silent. The weight of what they just learned was immense. Their ancestor hadn't simply come from Africa. She came from a specific people, a specific land, a nameable lineage. An elderly woman, Clara, one of Abeni's great-great-granddaughters, spoke with quiet pride. All those years, she said, we wore those beads, made that same pattern. We thought it was just family tradition, but it was her. We were keeping her alive, keeping Africa alive. In the months that followed, the museum partnered with Dr. Adabio and Nigerian scholars to create a cultural exchange. Plans were set for Abeni's descendants to travel to Oyo, to walk the same earth their ancestors once walked, and to learn firsthand about the traditions that had survived against all odds. Rachel curated a new exhibition titled Abeni's Necklace, One Pattern, 5 Generations, 2 Continents. At its heart stood the 1860 photograph, restored, magnified, and illuminated so that visitors could see every bead clearly. Around it unfolded the story Rachel had uncovered, the journey from Oyo to Virginia, from slavery to freedom, and the generations that kept the pattern alive. Glass displays showed the beadwork passed down through 5 generations. Each piece slightly changed, but still unmistakably linked to the original design. Diane and other family members had contributed heirlooms, creating a visual lineage of resilience. Dr. Okafor added a special section on Yoruba beadwork traditions, displaying authentic examples from Nigeria and explaining their spiritual meanings. Visitors could see the direct connection between those ancient symbols and the necklace Abeni once wore. But the most powerful element was the voices, the recorded testimonies of her descendants. Marcus spoke about growing up hearing stories of Mama Abeni, the woman who refused to bow to shame. Diane explained how learning the full meaning of the pattern had changed her entire sense of identity. Younger family members talked about finally knowing where they came from and why that mattered. The exhibition went beyond one family's story. It explored how enslaved people across the Americas had preserved African traditions through songs, recipes, languages, and spiritual practices. The panels made it clear these weren't acts of nostalgia, they were acts of resistance. Rachel wanted every visitor to feel that truth, the culture itself was survival. When the exhibition opened in February for Black History Month, over 70 of Abeni's descendants gathered beneath her photograph. Many wore necklaces, echoing the same beaded pattern, each bead a silent echo of the past. They stood together, not just as a family, but as living proof of endurance, of a legacy that refused to be erased. The impact reached far beyond the museum. Schools began bringing students to learn how African heritage lived on despite slavery. Genealogists studied Abeni's case as a model of tracing identity through memory and craft. Artists and beadworkers began reviving Yoruba designs, giving them new life. For the family, the discovery changed everything. Distant cousins found each other. Reunions were held. An online archive grew, connecting hundreds of names and faces under one shared story. Diane took on the role of family historian, teaching beadwork in community centers and schools. This isn't about the past, she told her students. It's about survival. When we create these patterns, we're saying, we're still here. The family even established a scholarship in Abeni's name, supporting young historians and artists studying African heritage. In the end, that necklace, once worn quietly by an enslaved woman, became a voice across centuries, a voice that said, "You can take me from my home, but you can never take my history." Abeni's story didn't end with the museum walls. Her legacy grew, branching outward, crossing oceans, reconnecting a family with its roots. Several of her descendants joined the cultural exchange program that Dr. Adabio helped create. They traveled to Nigeria, tracing the same soil their ancestors' mother once walked. In Oyo, they were welcomed by local historians and Yoruba elders. They listened to traditional drummers, watched the beadworkers' hands move with sacred rhythm, and stood in ceremonies meant to honor the spirits of the lost. It was more than a trip. It was a return. For the first time in nearly 200 years, Abeni's family stood under the same sun their ancestor had been taken from. Many wept, not from sorrow, but from recognition. The chain that had once bound their family in silence had finally been broken. 2 years after Rachel first discovered the photograph, the museum organized one final tribute, a collaborative art piece. The idea was simple, yet deeply symbolic. Each descendant would contribute a small section of beadwork, using the same ancient pattern Abeni had worn in 1860. Piece by piece, hundreds of tiny stories began to weave together. For 6 months, the family worked from across the country, children learning from grandparents, elders teaching the rhythm of the pattern once more. When the finished work was unveiled, it took everyone's breath away. A vast tapestry of beaded panels now hung in the museum's central atrium, shimmering under the light. Each bead told a story. Each pattern carried memory. And in the center, framed behind glass, the 1860 photograph that had started it all. At the installation ceremony, Rachel stood beside Diane, Marcus, and over 100 family members. She looked up at the photograph and spoke softly to the crowd. "When I first saw this image," she said, "I almost overlooked her. She was in the background, out of focus, invisible to history. But when we chose to look closer, we found a story far greater than the one that was meant to be told." This pattern, 3 white, 2 red, 1 black, traveled across an ocean, through slavery, through generations. And now it stands here in the Smithsonian as proof of what cannot be destroyed, the human spirit and the memory it carries. Marcus stepped forward, his voice trembling with age, but strong with pride. "Abeni couldn't have known her photograph would survive," he said. "She couldn't have known that her necklace would one day tell her story. But I believe she hoped. That's why she wore it. She wanted to be seen, to be remembered. And today she is." A cultural practitioner from Nigeria offered a Yoruba blessing over the beadwork. The words echoed softly through the hall, ancient syllables carried by a modern voice. Many wept quietly. Some prayed. In that moment, history felt alive. After the ceremony, the installation became one of the museum's most visited exhibits. Teachers brought students to see it. Researchers studied it as a living example of resistance and preservation. But for Abeni's family, it was more than history. It was home. They returned often, bringing new generations to stand before that photograph. Parents would lift their children, pointing at the young woman in the faded image. "That's where we come from," they'd whisper. And there she remained, eternally 20 years old, standing in the background of a long-forgotten portrait, wearing her mother's necklace and her people's legacy around her neck. In that quiet defiance, she had kept her heritage alive when doing so was dangerous. Her descendants kept it alive through slavery, reconstruction, and the struggles of a new century. Now, her story stands as a voice across time, a voice that refuses silence. Abeni's necklace became more than an artifact. It became a message. I am here. I remember. I survive. And now, finally, I'm seen.